دقيقة. شكرا على احترامك الوقت، وأنا خايف من سعد بالنسبة للوقت. سعد أنا حضرت لك الورقة قبل. سياسة الهجرة العامة في إسرائيل الفلاشة نموذجا.
صباح الخير. My research paper is titled Israeli Public Immigration Policies and the Ethiopian Immigration Experience to Israel, 1980 to 1996. Between 1947 and 1949, during the Nakba, Palestine was ethnic cleansed of hundreds of thousands of its Palestinian inhabitants. Jewish people from all over the world started immigrating to the newly created State of Israel in order to replace the forcibly displaced Palestinian population. The newly created State of Israel had to enact laws to ensure its viability and Jewish dominance. The Israeli law of return is the bedrock of this legal system. It states that every Jew had the right to come to this country as an Arab, a returning Jewish citizen. Later on, this legal right was granted and extended to encompass the offspring of Jewish citizens. Jews living in Ethiopia became encouraged to immigrate to Israel. However, Israel needed to legally recognize the status of the community as Jews. The Jewishness of Ethiopians were doubted until 1973, when Chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yusuf, recognized them as Jews, thus enabling them to receive the Israeli citizenship under the conditions of the law of return. This was confirmed in 1975 by the government, a decision that opened the way to their immigration. Jewish Ethiopians were very determined to immigrate to Israel, putting behind their backs more than 300 years of religious persecution that relegated their status from Baghdad, Israel, to falashas, exiles, or people without right to land, strangers. In Ethiopia, Jews were a symbol of evil and inferiority, a disgrace that degraded their socio-economic status. Rejection that Ethiopian Jews experienced at home reinforced their sense of non-belongingness in Ethiopia and induced spiritual momentum to their immigration to Israel. They viewed Israel as a utopian resort. In 1981, Saad smuggled 2,000 Ethiopians to Israel. Between November 1983 and January 1985, another 7,000 were airlifted from refugee camps in Sudan in what became known as Operation Moses. In 1991, an Israeli covert military operation named Operation Solomon was launched and airlifted over 14,000 Beta Israel. The Ethiopian Israeli community today stands at more than 130 citizens in Israel. However, this journey had left deep and strong psychological and physical effects on the immigrants. A typical journey to the border from Ethiopia to Sudan lasted from 3 to 5 weeks, and sometimes it lasted more. It was followed by a stay in a refugee camp in Sudan from 1 to 2 years. Ethiopians considered that they experienced a parallel experience of suffering to their European Jewish counterparts on the road of nationalism, thus expected an honorable reception from their counterparts. Upon arrival to Israel, immigrants from both Operation Moses and Operation Solomon were met by two master plans formulated by the State of Israel to facilitate the integration and the absorption of them. It's important to examine the Ethiopian experience in its context. The historical context of immigration to Israel is part of a more broad context of European colonialism. So it's an imperative to incrementally follow the construction of Jewish nationalism and its interplay with ethnicity and race, and their impact finally on immigration policies. Ernest Kellner defines nationalism as a political principle, which holds that the political and the cultural unit should be congruent. It's the striving, as he states, to make culture and polity congruent, to endow a culture with its own political roof. Thus, Gellner is speaking of homogeneity in cultural phenomena that leads eventually in the development of a high culture, which demands a protective state, which is the basis for a nationalist movement. Theodor Herzl, one of the prominent founding fathers of Jewish nationalism, has once uttered that I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, even though it sometimes takes these forms. It's a national question. This call for a Jewish national body was specifically directed toward European Jews who underwent persecution late in the 19th century in the Russian Empire. Thus, it's concluded that anti-Semitism was the keystone of Jewish nationalism. Additionally, the atrocities of the Holocaust inflicted upon European Jews consolidated their national consciousness. Subsequent to the establishment of the State of Israel, ethnic discourse tended to demarcate clearer lines of belonging within the national body. And in this context, geographic proximate ethnic groups tend to compete with each other, seeking status, recognition, and comparative advantage. Eventually, a dominant ethnic group leads the national project. In order to understand the intensity of the aforementioned ethnic competition, it can be viewed, it's an imperative to view the existing state model of Israel. Sami Samouha defines it or describes it as an ethnic model. Usually, in order to enhance our understanding of this ethnic conflict, we have to view it through its paradigm. Usually, we're talking about a republican or an ethnic state model. A republican model prioritizes the civil rights of the individual citizen. The ethnic model links citizenship to membership of a nation defined by a community of descent, and it's exemplified by Germany and Israel. Samouha defines the state model of Israel as an ethnic democracy, claiming the confer of political and civil rights upon all citizens, however, excluding Arab Israelis from certain rewards granted for Jews only. It's obvious now that a European ethnic identity characterizing the State of Israel will add a different understanding of Israel's ethnic democracy, thus implying an internal ethnic conflict between Western and Eastern Jewry. Saad illustrates that the colonial European state model of Israel imposes a serious harm on the well-being of non-dominant ethnic groups, reaching a point when their civil rights are in jeopardy. An understanding of such an ethnic colonial paradigm will be incomplete without examining race relations. Frantz Fanon states that color is the most obvious outward manifestation of race. It has been made the criterion by which men are judged, irrespective of their social attainments. The white Ashkenazi family, as any white settler family, is the nucleus of the settler society. Fanon adds that the white family is the workshop in which one is trained and shaped for life in society. On the other hand, some argue that the extent of division between Eastern and Western Jewry is exaggerated because Western Jewry didn't deny the Eastern's belongingness to the nation. Now moving to the public immigration policies, approaches on absorption and integration of the Ethiopian immigrants. Israel started adopting direct absorption policies in the 1980s and were applied on Russian immigrants in the 90s. According to this new policy, the state provides new immigrants with an absorption basket and leaves them to their own devices. They decide where to live, what job to take, and how to spend their money. The integration process of Russian immigrants in the 90s was characterized by a very friendly, tolerant stance toward Russian culture. Immigration policies concerning their integration imposed lesser constraints on their cultural practices, and as a result, Russian immigrants practiced their language, preserved their cultural identity, and operated their own stores. Some consider that this tolerance is an evidence on multiculturalism in the Israeli society. On the other hand, it was believed by certain influential Ashkenazi circles in Israel that the Russians would strengthen Ashkenazi demographics and high culture against Mizrahi Jews and Arabs. Moving to the Ethiopians' experience. Ethiopians were indirectly absorbed and integrated under the auspices of the Jewish Agency and had to spend 1 year in absorption centers in Israel, learning Hebrew and undertaking medical examinations and socializing. Afterwards, they moved to permanent housing. The main advantage of permanent housing was the provision of all the integrative services under one roof. On the other hand, the Israeli Ministry of Immigrant Absorption claims that the main reasons underlying indirect absorption were the lack of human capital and of Ethiopians and the insufficient state resources. Ethiopians were placed in religious schools for their first year, and afterwards they were given a choice of their own, where to continue their studies. Ethiopian children in some cases were denied access to Israeli school on the pretense that they were not prepared for the type of study provided there. This is an evidence on firm immigration policies toward Ethiopian immigrants. The indirect approach of absorption and integration made Ethiopians dependent on the state and contributed alleviating their process of absorption as a social problem. An important incident that took place in 1996 would enhance our understanding to this immigration experience. On January the 24th, 1996, an investigative journalist revealed that Israel was disposing blood contribution from Ethiopian citizens. The Ministry of Health were quick to announce that it did so because of fear of HIV high concentrations in Ethiopian blood. Nevertheless, clashes took place between 8,000 angry Ethiopian protesters and the Israeli police, and chants of anti-racism and anti-apartheid were heard. Finally, in conclusion, the State of Israel has invested a lot of resources in bringing Ethiopian Jewish immigrants to Israel in order it can empower its demographics and market itself as a haven for Jews. However, this immigration formed one of the clearest examples on how public immigration policies fueled by ethnocracy and racism can lead to failure in absorption and integration. Viewing this experience without examining its colonial context would limit the discussion to essentialist, orientalist thought of tradition versus modernity, regression versus development, and the Ethiopians and their traditional culture will be the target of blame. Finally, Israel treated all the Ethiopian Jewish population as a plague by not accepting their blood donations and by injecting their women with contraceptives, thus stigmatized them as a social group and limited their offspring. Wouldn't such practices jeopardize the Zionist goal of having a Jewish demographic edge over Arabs? Or such an edge is supposed to be maintained mainly by white Europeans mainly, thus blowing up the whole existential concept of Jewishness. Can a black woman or a man earn a full Jewish status in Israel, or blackness and Jewishness are mutually exclusive? Is an Ethiopian living in Israel a modern Palestinian Jew? Thank you.
شكرا سعد على احترامك للوقت، على التزامك بالوقت. هنا يعني بس باختصار شوي صغير حاول سعد الغوص في تجربة أخرى مختلفة إلى حد كبير ربما عن المداخلة السابقة، وإن كان عامل إدماج واضحا في الحالتين. في حالة إسرائيل هل يمكننا الحديث عن سياسات مغايرة، بمعنى أن إسرائيل هي من فاوضت وخططت باستقدام مهاجرين إلى بلدهم الجديد؟ أقصد بلدهم، قصدت كلمة بلدهم الجديد بين قوسين. هناك تحولات كبيرة حدثت خلال هذه الفترة. محليا بداية انتهاء الحكم العسكري بالضفة الغربية من قبل إسرائيل، الاهتمام أكثر بالاستيطان وتوسيعه وتجديد السياسات واستخدام مهاجرين جدد لمن العامل الديموغرافي للأهمية. تحولات على المستوى الدولي، سقوط الاتحاد السوفيتي، واهتمام إسرائيل أو تحول الاهتمام الإسرائيلي باستخدام مهاجرين أكثر بين قوسين حضارة أوروبية أو غربيين. هنا التناقض واضح بين رغبة وتضحية إسرائيلية في استخدام اليهود حتى وإن كانوا فلاشة، وسياسات بين قوسين عنصرية إن كان باستطاعتنا قول ذلك نحو القادمين اليهود من إثيوبيا، وإعاقة تسهيل اندماجهم في المجتمع الجديد. أي دور هنا للمجتمع المدني في التأثير على سياسات الحكومة؟ يمكن هذا أيضا مطروح للنقاش. شكرا مرة أخرى. والآن الكلمة للطالب أشرف مناصرة، هو أيضا طالب ماجستير. ما حدا